Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I know it's 5 o'clock on Wednesday, second to last day. At least we're not the last day, right? No. My name's Abner Oakes, and I am Director of Outreach and Partnerships at the Alliance for Excellent Education based in Washington, D.C. We are a policy, advocacy, and practice organization based in Washington. We've been there since 1999. We focus on high schools and ensuring that kids, particularly historically underserved kids, graduate from high school, have sort of significantly positive post-secondary options available to them, get into good careers, and ultimately make important contributions to our communities. That's what we've been doing since 1999 through both advocacy and policy, and we're starting to do more and more practice-related work in state and school districts. Some of you may know some of our work that the Alliance does. We do work around deeper learning, for example. We also run Digital Learning Day, and we run the PISA assessment score release here in the States when OECD wants us to. This area of work, and I'm going to introduce David in a second. He's being patient as I'm rambling on here. This area of work is relatively new for us. And this science of learning, this kind of adolescent neurodevelopment work, we see as being really, really important in trying to close the achievement gap for young people. We want to go after any research that we think can do this work, and we've been kind of blown away in the last 6 months about it. And I hope as you listen to sort of the kind of work that David's doing, you will feel the same way too. Let me actually turn to David. David is an assistant professor of developmental psychology at U of T Austin. He's a local guy, and he was kind enough to agree to be in this little confab that he and I will have. Will you say a little more about you and your work and your background? That's
Sure.
Okay.
My name is David Yeager. I'm a developmental psychologist. I'm a former mediocre middle school teacher in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I left the classroom enlivened by the possibility of what we could do as adults to create places where young people would be thrilled to learn. And I've been throwing myself at the question in our experiment to try to understand what can we do better. If we say this, if we say that, what helps young people come to want to deeply learn given the content that we put in front of them? And I'd love to share some of the things we're learning and some of the things that I'm learning as I look out in the field.
One of the things that David and I have in common is I taught middle and high school for 16 years, actually, before I got to my policy and advocacy work. And I also have a 15-year-old, too. So David and I are in the throes of conversation about this work that's going on, and then I go home and I kind of live the adolescent brain and what's happening with my guy as a 10th grader in high school. Before, though, we start, good high school, middle school teachers that we are, before that we start, I wanted to sort of throw a couple of Slido polls up for you, right? I think you can go to slido.com, you may have your app, but we want to get some sense of like who's here. So we created a quick poll just to simply ask, who are you? Are you a student, a teacher, a school administrator, district person, state level? Are you a researcher, policymaker, other? Can you just do that real quickly to kind of give David and me a sense of who is here in this room? Please. I kind of want to ask.
Well, it looks like we have less clarity than we did previously.
Yeah, exactly. I want to ask, I don't know if we should do this, but I want to ask, who are the others, if I can ask? Librarians. Thank you. Nonprofit, okay, thank you. Technical assistance, thank you. EdTech startup, thank you. Law school dean. That's great. Thank you very much. Next time will be a more specific poll.
We'll have more boxes for law school deans.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Second poll. Again, good middle and high school teachers that we are, we do our KWL chart. Remember your KWL chart at the beginning of your unit, right? You're teaching a poem by Mary Oliver. You want to kind of know what people know. So what do you know about adolescent neurodevelopment, about the science of learning? Some, a good deal, expert, or none. And experts we might have to ask up here, too, if, you know, so be careful.
I would say some.
Some. Okay, some, good. Well, we hope to give you more, right, today. So can we go back to the PowerPoint deck, please? Thank you very much. Thanks, audience. And the next slide, hold on, where's my clicker? Here it is, right here. Thanks. Here we go. So today, we're really talking about how can the science of learning be more useful to the U.S. public education system. And David and I want to address kind of three general buckets, right? What are the opportunities that we see, particularly the opportunities as they apply to policy and the rich opportunities that seem to be evolving out of the kind of research that David's doing? What are the challenges, right? What are the challenges certainly for researchers, for policymakers, and for practitioners in this work? And what might the future bring? If David and I were to come back here in 2 or 3 years, right, to do redux here, what would the future kind of tell us? Or what would we know 2 or 3 years down the line around this work? So I have 2 slides here, and I'm just going to skip so you can see both of them here, right? One is I want to talk about sort of opportunities within ESSA, and then talk a little bit about states and districts, okay? So again, keeping on that opportunity piece there. As many of you know, ESSA is pushing now the work on education back out to the states after NCLB brought it back into kind of federally controlled. It's now much more state controlled. And I just grabbed 3 pieces out of the statute related to the kind of work that David is doing, the kind of work around the science of learning. One is we know that ESSA provides a broader definition of student success, right? That the 5th indicator, as it's called, right, allows for states, it actually requires states to identify something beyond test scores, right? A school climate survey, advanced courses that students might be taking as a way to measure student and school success, right? So we know that there's this broader definition of student success within the statute. 2, schools, and you can see it right there, establishing learning environments and enhance students' effective learning skills that are essential for school readiness and academic success. This actually shows up in 2 parts of the law. One in Title II, as it relates to teacher professional development, teacher, school leader, so on, professional development. And in Title IV, Part A, it also shows up in there too. And then lastly, again in Title IV, there's this specific recommendations for activities to support safe and healthy students. And I wrote down a little more detail on this. Bear with me one second here. Where within this, they talk about, quote, safe, healthy, supportive, and drug-free environments that support student academic achievement, improving instructional practices for developing relationship-building skills, such as effective communication, and then lastly, implementation of school-wide positive behavioral interventions in support. So we know that there is language within the law that aligns well with science of learning, with adolescent neurodevelopment. That's the federal side. The state side, as I showed you before, whoops, excuse me. There we go. Let me just stop for a second here, though, and talk about states and districts kind of in a larger context, right? States and districts have never stopped innovating. Even within the No Child Left Behind era, states and districts were doing innovative work, right? The two states that I bring up here, Maine and Vermont, I don't know if there's any Mainers or Vermonters in the room, right? But they were doing this work back in 2013 around competency-based or standards-based grading, around having students collect evidence of their own achievement, right? So states and districts have always been innovators. The question is, with something like ESSA, will that freedom allow states and districts to do more of that? Will it push them to do more of that, right? So I bring up these examples of these two states, Maine and Vermont, as they've been doing this great work. Will they serve as models for others within an ESSA era to push them to do even more, too? I didn't put any districts. I realized I call it states and districts, right? But I didn't put any districts on here. There are too many to put on there. I think immediately of the core districts in California and the work that they're doing there. I think, too, of a colleague of mine is from Delaware. She told me of the 4 Brink districts in that state that are focused on personalized learning plans, that are focused on specifically cognitive development within kids. So here's a couple of state examples. Certainly districts that are doing this work are innumerable. And again, a good question will be, how will ESSA kind of push this even further? So I'm going to turn it over to David, but what I want to say is this, we're going to stop after David's slides to see if there's any questions about what he goes through. We can use Slido, or we can also, people just want to ask questions, we can do that too. So we'll take a quick break after David's section to see if people have specific questions about what he goes over.
Great. Hi, everyone. Again, thanks so much for coming. What I want to do is provide just a brief taste of a few findings from the neuroscience that seem to me to be relevant to the challenge facing schools and districts in an era in which there's greater emphasis potentially on the need for deeper learning and also social-emotional learning. The caveat is I'm a consumer of this research. I'm a psychologist in a psychology department. My work is mostly behavioral. We do some emotions and hormones. But the reason why I think it could be helpful for me to summarize this, although these aren't my studies, except for the final one, is that this is the level of summary that is likely to happen as districts try to start consuming this neuroscience and applying it one way or another. Let's kind of narrow our scope to adolescence, although there's a lot we could say about early childhood, the effects of toxic stress on the brain. But let's think about adolescence. So in the last, 10 years, the dominant narrative in neuroscience, from my view, is this narrative of adolescence as a time where there's great risk and great opportunity, in particular coming from a strong increase in surgency, sensation-seeking, novelty-seeking regions of the brain, that is, pleasure regions of the brain, and slower maturation in regions of the brain that might provide a kind of brake against that. So the metaphor that's often been used is all gas, no brake, and not very good at steering for adolescents. So what kinds of data are used to make this argument? So one type of study is some beautiful work by B.J. Casey, a real leader in the field. And this is a great summary of the adolescent brain and self-control in this journal, Current Directions in Psych. And B.J. Casey, so they do a task where you're supposed to accurately and quickly identify some kind of pattern. And they, in the middle of the task, switch the pattern on you. So there's a rule, and then they switch it. And sometimes they switch the rule, and it's all emotionally neutral content. So it's puzzles. Sometimes, though, it's emotionally laden content. In this case, emotional faces, like smile or anger faces. What they find is that on trials where it's emotionally neutral content, teenagers do just as well as children and adults. But when you have to do the task after attending to emotional information, teenagers seem to do worse. That is, they seem fixated on anger, sadness, whatever emotional display is coming from the faces in the trials. So you see here that even though adults have kind of higher, their overall abilities are higher than both children and teens' abilities in terms of general intelligence are higher than children, teenagers actually make more mistakes on this, right? Then in the brain, well, oh, I don't know why it's there. Okay, well, imagine there's a picture of a brain. So in the brain, what happens is there's an area called the nucleus accumbens, which is in the ventral striatum, which are related to sensation-seeking and pleasure. What they find is that adolescents in particular show increases in activation in regions like the ventral striatum. And this is taken as evidence for difficulty in adolescence managing emotional responses for the sake of other goals. But another interpretation of this that some have advanced is that adolescents are actually better at processing social and emotional stimuli, pay more attention to it, in particular when they offer the chance to kind of gain some kind of respect in the community. That is, that adolescents seem to outperform children and adults when the information that they're attending to can help them gain some kind of admiration. So this is seen as a window of opportunity, that adolescents may be overly responsive to emotional information from their peers, but also that can be a lever, that it might drive greater behavior change toward positive outcomes. Another interesting study that I love, done, I know about it through one of the co-authors, Ron Dahl, a collaborator of mine, who, what they did was they had real moms record audio of themselves telling teenagers all the things about them that they didn't like, needed to do. And then they put them in the scanner, and they looked at what brain activation happens when mom is nagging you to change the annoying stuff that you're doing. So, for instance, one mom said in the study, "One thing that bothers me about you is that you get upset over minor issues. I could tell you to take your shoes from downstairs. You'll get mad that you have to pick them up and actually walk upstairs, put them in your room. You'll get mad if I tell you your room is a little dirty. It just needs sweeping and dusting. You get upset if your sisters want to do something you don't agree on. 3 of you do, and you don't want to do it. You get upset too easily. You just need to calm down." And so what they find, so these slides aren't cooperating.
They are. No.
What they find is that activation in regions of the brain related to anger were elevated in adolescence. And activation in regions of the brain related to planning how to change were less effective. To say it differently, when teenagers hear a list of things they need to change about their personal lives, then anger goes up in the brain, and thinking about how to change goes down, at least in this sample. And you string these two studies together, and you start seeing a pattern. And let's bring it together with a third study that and I'll tell you the broader context for this. But the basic idea is, see this picture of brains here, the kind of red brain and the green brain. This is a study by Jason Mosier at Michigan State. What they did was they measured students' fixed in growth mindset, their beliefs that intelligence is fixed, or the beliefs that intelligence could change. And what they found was that students could put themselves in those buckets, that students could be arrayed on a spectrum from believing that smartness is fixed to smartness can change. And then they created a task. And in this task, they had adolescents do something kind of hard where they could make a mistake And right after you made a mistake, you had a pause, you had a moment where you could decide, am I going to change my strategy before the next trial or not? Okay? And then they do the trial again, and then they make another mistake, and then a pause, and there's some period of time. And so the design is set up so that they're scanning the brain. This is an EEG study, so they're looking at, this isn't a scan, they're looking at levels of blood activation in certain regions, which is a signal of how much certain regions are being used, therefore being engaged in thinking. What they're looking at is a certain region of the brain cooler or warmer in that moment when you have a chance to possibly change how you solve the problem. What they find in this study is that for students who think you're either smart or not, then regions of the brain related to planning and changing your behavior and fixing your mistakes showed lower activation. That is, adolescents weren't thinking in that moment how they could fix something, how they could change it. For adolescents who thought intelligence could grow, that it's malleable, that it's responsive to effort, those adolescents showed greater activation in the brain in that moment where they had made a mistake and could possibly. So now let's kind of string these things together, right? What happens in the transition to high school? You're not just going to algebra. You're also looking around the classroom, seeing who's attractive, who's not, who's going to make fun of you, who's not, right? That, like, teenagers have two jobs in ninth grade, to get good grades and to be with their friends. And those are sometimes in conjunction, but a lot of times they're in competition. And if you think of adolescence as a period in which the brain is really easily hijacked by emotional information, and where all of your attention, or much of it, could be allocated to how you're doing socially, right? That maybe leads to a slightly different version of how we engage our students. Now imagine that student sitting in a class. Wait a second, are people making fun of me? Are they admiring me? Who's noticing my pimples, right? No one's texting me back. Does this mean I'm a loser? I'm going to have no friends at my high school reunion? That's a quote from a student of ours in a study, right? That's what that kid is thinking about, presumably, some of the time. And then how do adults often respond? Do your homework. Get to work, right? And that's a lot like those brains under the mom nagging condition, right? And then when adolescents don't change, when they don't reallocate their attention, right? In a sense, it becomes like a tug of war between adults' values and the young people's values. And so now imagine that it's a student of color or a first-generation student. What might the teacher think? Maybe the teacher might think this student is disengaged. Maybe the student doesn't value an education. Don't you know you can get a job in the future, right? Now you've created a competition between the second marshmallow way in the future or immediately attending to how you're doing socially right now, right? So viewed from this perspective, this is informed by neuroscience. This doesn't only come from neuroscience. But viewed from that perspective, we can think of the challenge facing us in our schools in a slightly different way. It's not just a challenge in education of how clearly can we say something or how gamified can we make it. Adolescents are also thinking a lot about whether they're going to be a respect-worthy person in the eyes of people whose opinions they care about. And how does that compete with the type of academic work that I have? What we've done is shared some of this neuroscience with adolescents in the form of an online mindset program. We told them, if you learn, you grow your brain. We don't say grow because in pilot testing, kids thought that meant the brain would be too big and would ooze out their ears. We also don't oversell the you can grow your brain, because one time we did that and a kid in a pilot, and a kid said, well, the drug people were here last week and they told me that my brain cells are going to die. So does this mean I can do all the drugs I want because my brain can grow? So we don't say that either. But really it's just the idea that when it's hard, your brain is growing. Not when it's hard, it means you're dumb and everyone is looking down on you. Because if you think about how the social and emotional stimuli can hijack an adolescent's attention, then the fear that everyone thinks you're dumb is a strong fear you have to deal with. So in a growth mindset, when students learn that brain growth is possible, and in our studies, that there's a reason to do it, that you could make perhaps some kind of difference in the world if you were able to grow and develop your brain. That is, we give them an immediate status-worthy reason to be a learner right now, in this moment, not in the future. Right now, you might learn something that could help you address injustice in the world and unfairness with a stronger brain. Would that help young people feel like it's worth making that trade-off? Attention now on the schoolwork rather than later. So in an experiment, we had this version of an online mindset program, and we delivered it to 76 U.S. public high schools, randomly selected from a list of all 12,000 public high schools. Why would you randomly select high schools? You do that because if you only pick the 10 schools that want to be in a growth mindset study, then maybe you get a different answer than you would get if you mandated growth mindset for a district. So we have to start with a random sample of people who view us with a measure of skepticism. And the question is, would the program be effective even there? So it takes about 30 minutes twice over the internet. We did about 95% of kids. We find that we can uniformly increase reports of growth mindset across those 76 schools. But we have the initial data from just the first few schools who have already submitted their grades. And here's what you see. At the end of the year, it's not really cooperating.
That's right, this way. The computer's over there somewhere. Next slide, please.
Let me go to the next slide.
Thanks. Yeah.
This is the most suspenseful reveal of data of all time.
Dun.
All right. Hopefully that's as impressive as the weight was, making you think. This is just the bell curve of grades for kids who got a control group. That they saw some cool things about the brain, but it didn't say anything about changing your brain, versus kids who got this just 2 sessions over the internet. And what we see is that, these are just bell curves, and the x-axis is how much better kids are doing compared to what you'd expect based on 8th grade grades. These are the early results, so you're the first people to see this. And these results will certainly vary across schools and across context. But what you see is that just a little redirection in just kind of pointing the arrow a little bit more for the idea that right now you can learn, you can grow, your brain can develop, and that can bring you some measure of respect because you can do something of consequence for others, for your family, for the world. Led students to be more willing to take on hard work. In a past study for first-generation low-income minority students, this decreased DF averages by about 8 to 12 percentage points over the course of a year. So it's not the whole problem of the achievement gap, and this isn't the only way to teach a growth mindset, and we're still learning a lot about this. We don't think this is a silver bullet in any way, but what this does suggest is that not only might research about the brain help us, when integrated with behavioral work, to think a little bit differently about the goals of our reforms in ESSA, but in some cases at least, sharing some of this research with adolescents themselves might give them a little bit of self-insight and might even allow them to see their own personal reasons for deeply committing themselves to the ambitious learning goals that we put in front of them. So let's pause maybe for questions.
Let's stop. We were going to kind of do Q&A at the very end, but we thought after David's section to stop and ask questions.
Great. So
specific to the research, but we can also talk about these two. So and we have a mic, I think, too, in case people just want to do that rather than the slide up.
So ESSA is the Every Student Succeeds Act, and it's a replacement law for No Child Left. Can you teach a learning mindset? Is it an innate skill? Thank God you asked that. It's not innate at all. Certainly the love of learning can vary across individuals, even from due to temperament. But the mindsets that we talk about are learned adaptations, right? That individuals learn a theory. What does it take to succeed here? Ability or effort or help from others? And so just like you can learn it through interactions with adults, you can learn a different theory through, in some cases, relatively time-limited online exercise.
Hey, can I ask a follow-up on that?
Sure.
How about me? Can I can I still have a learning? When does this stop for people?
Well, if it's a belief, you can change it at any time. I mean, the personality, when you measure personality traits at 2 time periods, in general, it becomes more stable later in development. So kids have more unstable personality traits. Teenagers actually more unstable than kids. But it's not clear if that's because they can't change or because you increasingly select into environments where everyone treats you the same way. Mm-hmm. So if you have had a fixed mindset and have avoided deep intellectual challenges for a long time, you might have relationships with people where they expect that of you, treat you in that way. Just like if you're an extrovert, people expect you to be an extrovert. So traits, even if you can measure them as a person, they're not only inherent to a person, they're also constructed in your relationship. It means you can, but let me answer your question concretely. We do a lot of work with community college students, adults going back to remedial math, and we teach them this growth mindset, teach them about the brain, and it's like a revelation to them. People say, I'm not a math person, I've never been a math person. They have like math scar tissue from decades of being in algebra forever. And sometimes, some of those students really show dramatic improvement when we teach them this mindset. But critically, we don't just say, you need to believe this. In all of these studies, when we teach mindset, we say, hey, you've got some wisdom. Would you mind explaining this to someone else? Next year's students, they're going to have some despair. It probably could be helpful if you could share what resonated with you about these messages. Mm-hmm. And in the process of explaining and actually persuading someone else, often what those studies find is that people end up convincing themselves, at least somewhat, of the mindset. Okay. So it's not magic, but you can make some progress on mindsets at any age, we think.
Yep.
Teacher practices, great question. I think that is what you would call the high-hanging fruit. And I call it that because it feels like it's hard to change teenagers. I don't think it's actually that hard to change teenagers when they're motivated to be a kind of person. Also, identities are really flexible. It's pretty hard to change adults, not because they can't be changed, but if you're entrenched in a routine and you have a set of habits and you're on autopilot, and like me with 3 kids, and there's only a certain number of things I can change at once. So I think, yes, adults can be changed. I think teachers, as a former teacher, you're constantly bombarded with new routines and ways you have to change your practice. Hard to do a lot of that at once. So I think it's difficult to change anything about adults in almost any profession, and teachers are a profession, but not impossible. And there's some really promising work being done by Mary Murphy and Steph Freiberg. Steph has done this on the Native American reservation in Washington, really transformed the community there, the Tulalip Reservation. And then Mary Murphy, who's at Indiana, UT grad, is doing this work as well with teachers in college. And
can I add something to that? I was talking about Maine and Vermont before I started working for the Alliance. I was doing kind of technical assistance, professional development work with schools in Maine and Vermont and other places. What was fascinating about a Vermont school that I was working with that was going through a change to move to standards-based grading, to kind of a competency focus, is they actually used the kids to help the adults along, because the kids saw the value in learning for mastery. They saw the value in growth. And there were a couple really smart teachers that began to use their voices and the voices of the families who supported those kids to help the teachers too. It was a really powerful piece of their professional development to have students involved with that.
Yeah, that can be really powerful, because it's easy as a teacher to feel like you're trying something new and you're not getting the response you want. And if students are advocating for it, then it becomes easier to sustain that motivation. Exactly. I guess I would say classroom environments. That's a great question, because we don't find evidence for what you might call the naive, straightforward transmission of growth mindset. To be more specific, in a national survey, we asked, actually in the national study, we surveyed math. We asked teachers, have you read Carol Dweck's book, Growth Mindset? And we asked them their personal mindset. There's no association between having read the book and giving the right answer that was in that book. We then looked at, in another study, relatedly, answers to those questions predicting kids' perceptions that teachers had a growth mindset. Again, no association. Instead, what predicts whether a kid walks into a class and says, wow, I can grow here? What predicts that? Kyla Haimovitz, who's now a postdoc under Angela Duckworth, Character Lab, found that it's really how adults think and act about mistakes. Is a mistake something that you freak out about and you quickly move on and then solve the answer for students? Or is it something that needs to be paused on and looked at as an opportunity to troubleshoot, figure out what caused the mistake? And we looked at it, we asked adults open-endedly, how would you respond to a student who made a mistake? Teachers who say, I would tell them to come after class for more help, actually implied more of a fixed mindset to their students, because it implies this kind of stigma of remediation. Kind of work hard alone, just go do it. The teachers who conveyed a growth mindset in word and deed were ones who said, let's look at what you did, troubleshoot it, try something new, see what happens. This kind of open-ended hypothesis testing version of interaction with students. So environments definitely correlationally at least seem to convey growth mindsets, but the simplistic version so far in the research hasn't yielded the kinds of associations you might have to expect. Can schools and districts access these interventions? Yeah, hertz.net, www.perts.net. They're available for free. Any high school in the country can sign up right now. For a lot of reasons, we've just decided to never sell these products. So they're freely available for schools to use directly. Hertz also has something called mindsetkit.org. That's not experimentally tested. It's people's best judgment. So it's interesting to look at. And then there's a lot of really good vendors that I think are great. Agile Mind is one. Several others. So I think there's a lot of exciting work. Let's see. Do you think the grading system in public schools contributes to students having fixed mindsets? I don't know. I mean, I think, I'm not sure it's the grading system as much as the ethos that surrounds it, right? I mean, you could totally look at a C and be like, wow, I could get 2 more letter grades if I knew more. But students very rarely say that. They say, I'm a C student. So, I think feedback is how humans learn, and animals also. Well, it's like an iron law of the brain. The brain learns from feedback. So you need assessments, you need standards, and you need information about where you are relative to standards. But the constant social evaluation and comparison is probably not helpful. What we emphasize in our intervention is to not say, I can be just as proficient as anyone else if I just tried hard. We try not to encourage between-person comparison. Instead, we encourage what we call within-person comparison. I can know more tomorrow than I knew yesterday. And it's hard, if not impossible, to undo entirely, but it is possible to emphasize more the within-person. And that comes really from basic research on stroke patients. So stroke patients who focus on whether they have as much functioning as people who've never had a stroke recover more slowly as compared to stroke patients who focus on how they have more control over their muscles that now as compared to previous.
Should we go back to?
Sure.
Oh, we have a question over here.
Yeah.
Great.
Hi. Back in the early 2000s, 2002, 2003, my twin daughters were entering adolescence, and I had reason, in addition to just that, to do some research about adolescent brain development, and I happened across Jay Geed's research at the NIH, and across a book called The Primal Teen by Barbara Strout. And from what I learned about the then new information about adolescent brain development was, about how, they're basically packing up boxes in the amygdala and shipping them to the prefrontal cortex. And you know how it is when you're moving, you don't know where anything is. And I communicated that information to my daughters. And also, I came up with, to keep myself from yelling at times when you felt like yelling, I would go like this. Prefrontal cortex, it's just not there yet. Remind myself about the growth they were undergoing.
Yeah.
It really helped my girls to know what was happening in their brain, because subjectively, it felt like they were going crazy. One day they were very organized and could do lots of things. The next day they forgot everything, and they felt like they were losing their mind. They didn't interpret facial expressions, as you said. They couldn't tell. They thought I was angry with them when I was angry at my husband for something. And it was really helpful for them to have that information as they went through it. So what I wonder is, in addition to teaching, educators about adolescent brain development, is there a way of communicating that information to the students, to the ones who are going through it, so they understand more what's happening?
Yeah, it's a great question. I want to say three things. First, thoughtful and accurate communications of the neuroscience are a major priority for a number of foundations and initiatives right now. So people are working on that. Ford Foundation is working with others. Ron Dahl's group center on the developing adolescent, Berkeley. People are putting a lot of thought into it. Larry Steinberg has been a champion for summarizing this research long. Has a good book called Age of Opportunity. So you identified a challenge that we also think is great. Two, there's actually a lot of ambiguity in that research, which is the reason why I'm skeptical about number one. And so the idea of no control isn't quite true, because it's actually the case that adolescents have tremendous control when the goal is to have some kind of positive emotional experience. Take, for instance, the comparison of teenagers not doing their math homework carefully, right? Well, you guys are losing track of everything. Versus that same teenager who wants to impress a girl and learns how to play guitar, right? And the teenager might spend hours and hours and hours diligently practicing, right? Or like all of our Olympic athletes are like 14, right? So it's not like the teenage brain can't delay gratification or be diligent for the service of some kind of goal. What's happening though is, and I'm summarizing other people's research, is the connections are developing, and sometimes the cognitive control is used too much for certain emotional goals from the perspective of adult value. So that story is a little complicated, and it could go wrong in the sense, for some kids, some of the time, in the sense that it removes some culpability for actions and behavior. That too this is number three, is that if you make the argument, as some have successfully, that adolescents have poorer self-control in hot, emotionally charged situations, then you can successfully advocate for instance, youth violent offenders not having life sentences. And that was a Supreme Court case. They used this neuroscience, tremendous success. Those same legal precedents now are being used to remove teenagers' kind of reproductive rights or other kinds of rights. So when we think about the neuroscience, it's a powerful tool that can really change a lot of minds, and we can apply it towards one policy goal, but that same research in the record as a legal precedent can have effects on other policy goals that might be just as valued, not more valued, depending on someone's. So I think, and something we'll get back to, adolescent neuroscience has the weight of authority, feels like science, very persuasive. It's rarely definitive. We're often talking about studies of 12 people, 20 people. It's not always clear how the 20 teenagers are different, same as the 20 adults, the 20 children. And that's because of the constraints of the scanning. So there's inherent risk and potential for great reward in applying and teaching. Should I keep answering, or should we go on?
Can we go back to the deck real quickly, and we'll finish, and then we'll stop. We'll take 2 minutes. We'll go through our challenges. Why don't we
Sure.
talk about that?
Okay.
Challenges, and then we'll stop, because certainly there are lots of questions that are there. Thank you for your questions, too, by the way. Let's see here. I'm just going to skip through this. So future challenges, right? Researchers. Then a
Yeah.
miracle happens.
Yeah, I guess I would say that, as researchers, we know very little. I mean, we don't know very little, maybe nothing about policy. I'd err on the side of nothing for us. So we have this fable we tell ourselves that if we just run the set of studies and then clearly describe them, then a miracle will happen and wiser policy will matter. And that's not always the case, because even if you do the careful science, if it's packaged in a way where the one sentence takeaway is even a slight distortion, then it could turn into policy, even under the best conditions, that could result in the opposite. And I think in education, this is especially likely because of the education hype machine, where good ideas get ignored for a long time, then there's a popular book, and then everyone wants to do them. But often what happens is people rename what they were always doing as what the new fad is, and then it becomes a way of entrenching ourselves in old practice. And then when that old practice fails to change results because we're doing the same thing, then we discard the research and discredit it and say, see, it didn't really work. Wasn't it ridiculous for us to have? And so everyone can think of numerous examples in the last few decades, even going back to the 20s. Hayek and Cuban have written about this. So I think as researchers, we think we can just input things and hope that the hype machine turns it into something good. But I think we can do a better job of thinking in advance about actually doing more relevant work and actually characterizing our work more honestly and accurately. Because I think researchers have a lot of responsibility for how we've communicated things, under what conditions, how qualified we need to be. We could be way more qualified. And a lot of times we could just be doing more relevant studies to begin with, so that the practice community doesn't have to extrapolate. We would have tested what people wanted to know. People wouldn't have to overgeneralize. Yeah. So I think a lot of the onus happens on us as researchers, and I don't mean to blame the education community. I think it's true in healthcare and business as well.
Certainly the next bullet is related to what David just said. I was also thinking about this too, about leaving room for innovation, right? So how do policymakers kind of make policy that's going to move the needle, so to speak, but knowing that things will change, new studies will occur, how respond to that? And I mean, what is that balance, right?
I mean, ESSA is that right now, right? I mean, a lot of people interpret the fifth indicator as social and emotional learning, including growth mindset in some cases. And as I said today, I think we have a lot of evidence that growth mindset is a real construct that can affect learning, and that we can change it in some cases. I don't think we know very much at all about how to help adults create environments that constantly support those mindsets. And yet, it could potentially be a part of multiple states' accountability systems in a few months. Yeah. So I think we need to go faster as researchers, and I think eventually maybe we'll be glad that the policy window included the kinds of things that we study. But there's some hesitation, because what if it becomes a way of accelerating the science that discredits lots of careful work over several decades?
Yep, exactly. I'm gonna get through last slide here too, and then we'll stop, because we had tons of other questions too, which we'd love to answer. Certainly, David and I have talked about this. We do a lot of work at the Alliance around low grad rate high schools with Bob Balfant from Johns Hopkins. And right now, there's almost 3,000 low grad rate high schools. And this is where a third of the 2014 non-graduates came from these schools, right? So we're always thinking the Alliance, and I know that people like David are always thinking about this. How do we make sure that we get the research and the science right, but with some immediacy, right, with urgency, given the graduates and the non-graduates with each successive class, right? How do we make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I have often said, and didn't make this up, I'm sure I heard it somewhere, is that on a policy level, you can prescribe accountability for outcomes. You don't necessarily have to prescribe input. And I would say that what we do, what we specialize in, mindset, emotions, those are inputs. Those are one way.
Yep.
Those are one potential set of contributing factors to graduation rate. But maybe schools could achieve them through other means. Maybe just calling students would work. And so the model I often think of is the Chicago consortium work on the on-track indicator, where for 5 years each high school was accountable for its on-track rate at the end of freshman year, meaning proportion of students who didn't have D or F averages and certain amount of attendance. And there was no movement over 5 years. But then once, in Elaine Allensworth's analyses, once schools got the names of students every month, then schools could do something about it. They could call, they could go home, they could talk to parents. And the district didn't prescribe programs, they just held schools accountable for an outcome and then provided them the information.
Yep.
And so I think we can make tremendous strides toward a lot of problems, I think, as the science is maturing. And then as the science is maturing, then now we have better, more effective input, right? But the accountability and the measurement might be better kept on the outcome.
Yep, exactly.
Let's stop there. Thanks. We had more questions on Slido. Thank you, David. Let's do that. And there's a mic going around, and we're happy to hang out after 6. I don't know if there's anyone else in this room afterwards, too.
So should I answer these, or
Yeah.
are these the most recent ones?
Yeah.
Okay. There are a couple here that are missing that I thought.
Okay.
Okay, well, so let's talk about stereotype threat. So stereotype threat, coined by Claude Steele, is the idea that the awareness that your group could be negatively stereotyped and thought of as less intelligent in a setting itself can become an intrusive thought. And when individuals feel as though their success or failure could be interpreted as meaning that their group in general is low ability, then it can make students in that group underperform. So students in some studies are more likely to say, under threat conditions, wow, if I fail, people will think that all black students are not good at this type of task. And that's in Claude's original studies, looking at sources of the achievement gap between black and white. And so think, at the core of that is a belief that intelligence is a fixed quality and that others are going to judge your or your group's intelligence in a fixed way. That is, that you or others are on the lookout for an intelligence diagnosis. So Joshua Aronson's insight in the late 90s, as a postdoc at Stanford, he's now at NYU as a professor, was that perhaps you could short-circuit the stereotype threat process by taking the possibility of fixed intelligence off the table. If you conveyed to students that intelligence is not a quantity that can be measured once and for all, then perhaps students, particularly students of color, might be freed from feeling as though they have to validate their group. And that's what they found in some of the initial studies of growth mindset intervention. Mary Murphy's research, she's a stereotype threat researcher who then is linking it up with growth mindset, has found that some things teachers do exacerbate stereotype threat. For instance, my colleagues, unfortunately, at UT, sometimes have said, look to your left, look to your right, half of you are going to fail or aren't cut out for engineering. This is what I've heard in focus groups with some of our graduates. And what she finds when she gives students beepers, that they get beeps during their class, and students report, what did your teacher just say, and how did you feel about your belonging in this major, is that when professors talk on and on about smartness, genius, intelligence, then members of stereotyped groups interpret that as a sign that that professor will think that your group is not smart enough, and in particular that you're not smart enough. Now, for that student, in that circumstance, you can imagine the reluctance to raise your hand and ask about some physics proof, right? Some engineering concept that's poorly explained. And I can also guarantee you, I and many of my colleagues are not always great at explaining complicated. Students should be asking questions a lot. But if you see a question as a sign that you're going to be viewed as not smart, then that's a threat. And so professors who refrain from obsessing about raw ability and instead focus on the process through which knowledge was gained and kind of unpack the black box of how knowledge was acquired. What was the struggle someone had? What's the insight they had? What's the appropriate support they got at just the right time? Those types of professors alleviate stereotype threat by de-emphasizing the importance of raw. Are we out of time? How much time do we have?
4 minutes.
Okay. I'll keep answering questions, and feel free to add more up there. Preschool and kindergarten. That's a great question. I have a 6, 4, and 1-year-old. So every developmental psychologist overdoes the thing that they study. And so, thank God I'm not an attachment researcher. You would see my kids sitting in my lap here. What I ever do at home is growth mindset. So no one tells my kids that they're smart. They hear the F word a lot, but they never hear that they're smart. And we were on a hike recently, and there was like a waterfall, and I yelled back at my daughter's on my back, and I yelled back at my dad, "Oh, let's take the switchbacks. It's too hard to walk up this way." And my daughter's like, "No, Daddy, go the hard way. Do the hard thing." So it's like easy for you to say when I'm carrying you. So yes, kids learn causal theories all day long, right? Kids are just such innate scientists. They just really are curious about what causes what. And they infer from how we talk and how we act with them what causes success on some kind of task. And when we praise for intelligence, it has the potential to imply to young people that, the reason why you did that is because you were naturally intelligent. I've often thought, what if we could kind of super boost our Head Start programs that give kids intellectually stimulating tasks, which we know is part of the key ingredients why Head Start can work for disadvantaged kids. What if we then supplemented those instructional experiences with an environment that created a love of learning and a comfort with frustration? And there's some evidence that might work. Liz Gunderson, who's a professor, she was at University of Chicago, has a paper in 2013. I forget where she is now. Susan Levine as the senior faculty on that paper. They videotaped mothers playing with 2-year-olds and looked at whether mothers praised the kid for being a good thrower in the video or praised the process that the kid engaged in. "I love how you did that," or "Isn't this fun?" And they followed up with the kids when the kids were 7. And the question was, could how moms praise at age 2 predict whether kids are willing to learn the hard stuff at age 7? And what they measured was they put a hard puzzle in front of the kid or an easy puzzle. They said, here's 2 puzzles. One of these will be very hard. You might learn a lot. And one of these will be pretty easy. You won't learn anything. Which puzzle would you like? And how moms praised kids at age 2 predicted which type of puzzle kids wanted to do when they were age 7. Now, does that mean that you're in trouble if you have a given mindset at age 2? Is that too deterministic? Well, that's the exciting part, is that mindsets can be learned, but they can also be relearned. So it's both an explanation for some portion of underachievement, and it's an avenue for undoing and addressing some portion of I think that's all we have time for,
we should
right?
stop. We should stop. Please stick around. David and I will stick around. I know David has to leave for Colorado soon.
Heading to the airport.
Right? The car running outside, too?
My babysitter's in the car right now.
But happy to answer a few more questions. Thanks so much for spending your Wednesday evening with us. And let us know what more we can help you with. Thank you.